Seeds of Change, I learned very quickly, was a project of social entrepreneurship in that it was both a business and very clearly intended and designed to serve the common good in its broadest context, not only the common good as it relates to people, but as it relates to the ecology of the world and to the future sustainability and regeneration of life on Earth. And so I found that for me, business, which had always been sort of a double-edged sword and which I was acutely aware was becoming more and more problematic in terms of the concentration of wealth and power throughout the world, and the way that corporate greed was manifesting in tremendous harms, I realized that social entrepreneurship was a phrase that could encompass both the for-profit and nonprofit worlds, and that in fact, over time, as I have come to understand that we are in a moment where we need to reinvent everything about how we live with each other and on Earth, that social entrepreneurship is one of the most exciting and promising and wholehearted pathways that anyone could adopt. So for me, I choose that identity with great pride.
Welcome back to Integral Voices, convened and produced by the Center for Transformative Learning at Meridian University. I'm Aftab Omer, and I'm glad to be in conversation with Nina Simons for today's episode, Revisioning Entrepreneurship, Generativity, Indigeneity, and the Feminine. Nina Simons is perhaps best known as the co-founder and co-convener of the powerful and influential Pioneer Conferences, which have been an annual gathering for 30 years. Integral Voices is a video and audio podcast found on all podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as YouTube. To stay updated on upcoming episodes and to explore the archive, please visit meridianuniversity.edu/Integral Voices. Now, on to my conversation with Nina Simons. So welcome again, and could we jump in through this door? You very readily identify with, and have for a long time, you readily identify with being a social entrepreneur. Last week we had Lynn Twist join us as a contributing faculty, and it was interesting that she doesn't, but began to explore that with us in our conversation. And as you might know, she uses the phrase, since she likes to not use the phrase nonprofit, she's been using the phrase social profit.
Yes.
So you're a social entrepreneur and proud of it, presumably. And could you tell us how that became part of your identity?
Certainly. I think as I was in my 20s and really grasping for what kind of identity and what kind of work in the world I might wholeheartedly aspire to, I had a mentor who reflected to me that I had a gift and that I could sell ice to Eskimos. And I thought, ooh, that's just so sleazy. Why would I ever want to do that? And really, what I discovered was that what was most exciting to me was to awaken people to ideas rather than products, and to share stories that illuminate various aspects of the world that we're all bringing into form, I believe. So as I began working with my husband and partner and began promoting his film, which was 33 years ago, and it was actually a documentary about the politics of medicine. I really began honing my skills as someone who could share ideas in a way that helped them become accessible and spread. And my next career path really was a calling that I felt to serve the sustainability of the natural world through a company that my husband co-founded called Seeds of Change. And Seeds of Change, I learned very quickly, was a project of social entrepreneurship in that it was both a business and very clearly intended and designed to serve the common good in its broadest context, not only the common good as it relates to people, but as it relates to the ecology of the world and to the future sustainability and regeneration of life on Earth. And so I found that for me, business, which had always been sort of a double-edged sword and which I was acutely aware was becoming more and more problematic in terms of the concentration of wealth and power throughout the world, and the way that corporate greed was manifesting in tremendous harms, I realized that social entrepreneurship was a phrase that could encompass both the for-profit and nonprofit worlds, and that in fact, over time, as I have come to understand that we are in a moment where we need to reinvent everything about how we live with each other and on Earth, that social entrepreneurship is one of the most exciting and promising and wholehearted pathways that anyone could adopt. So for me, I choose that identity with great pride. And I'm very thankful for what you're doing, because I think exploring what these phrases mean and unpacking them in ways that can really make them viable life choices for talented and visionary people is one of the greatest services one could be providing on Earth at this time. So thank you very much for that.
Nina, we've been exploring the term generative entrepreneurship as a way to stretch what the social entrepreneurship conversation to a next stage or a next level, a certain kind of deepening of our understanding of social entrepreneurship. And this reminds me that you published a book in the last year on leadership, and you've been working with the phrase regenerative leadership. So could you connect some of what you said about social entrepreneurship with what is cohering for you in the phrase regenerative leadership?
Absolutely. And there are several things that your question raises for me. It's such a good question. I believe that we have inherited definitions that are self-limiting in and of themselves. Leadership being one, in that we have inherited models of leadership that often, without even being conscious of it, we have a tendency to ascribe to and to measure ourselves against. And I would suggest that the model of leadership we've inherited from our culture is a heroic one. It's a solitary model. It's a model where someone takes on a huge task and basically drives themselves into the ground to try to see it manifest. And I think as I have grown older, I've come to understand that often there is some requirement of sacrifice in real leadership. I used to think we could do without it, but I'm not so sure anymore. But what's become apparent to me is that as I work with people who are leading change in all kinds of domains, they tend to show up exhausted and depleted. And it's partly because often they are trying to lead whatever kind of company or organization they are heading up. And they're also parenting, and they're also trying to, with whatever scraps of time may be left, take care of themselves. And we are living in an increasingly toxic world where I believe we have inherited a bias towards those aspects of our humanity that we associate with the masculine, and an implicit disbias, if you will, towards those aspects we associate with the quote feminine. And because of that, we all have become action freaks. We all have very long to-do lists, and in order to live up to our own standards, we have a tendency to drive ourselves terribly, terribly hard. And this is not a regenerative model. It's a model for burnout in whatever sector of society we may be working to bring change. I'm also a student of indigenous cultures, and I believe we have inherited models from a patriarchal culture and a capitalist culture that tend to be very linear and very focused towards growth at all costs. And for me, part of what I've learned from studying the living systems that Bioneers often produces and features is that those linear models don't work. They have brought us to the edge of human and ecological destruction at this time. And so an indigenous model, of course, is based on a circle rather than a line. And so regenerative leadership works with that principle that, like geese who migrate in a V shape, the lead goose, who takes the most wind resistance, cycles back when it's tired to be replaced by another goose to take the beating of that wind resistance until the other lead goose is regenerated. And so, I feel as though part of the leadership model we have inherited is one which involves sacrifice to the point of complete depletion. And that's simply not viable. I think we're all in this work for the long haul. Knock on wood, if the earth doesn't shake us off first. And so taking care of ourselves and our community and those around us, while simultaneously lifting up other leaders, is really what I am seeing as the basics of a recipe for regenerative leadership. The other thing that I would add, Aftab, that I thought of when you were first describing the course is that social entrepreneurship implies that there is one priority, which is improving social conditions, to the intent of entrepreneurship. And really, I have come to understand that if we don't embed our social structures within a larger context of nature, of nature's life support elements, of what's good for the whole and equity, then really we are not dealing with the kind of systemic change that I believe is called for, which is really more about transformation than it is about change. What I love about the phrase generative entrepreneurship is that I do believe the earth is calling us to come up with ideas that are new and sometimes also ancient. And so what I have found is that the quality of generativity is one that often is undervalued when people talk about entrepreneurship. And generativity involves the capacity to pull something from the ethers or from an idea or from a dream or from an imaginal space into form. And that involves a very particular set of skills and capacities. So I'm excited for you to be naming it that.
I heard, while you didn't use the word values, I kept in my own mind hearing that word as you spoke in this last riff, and how much for you both leadership and entrepreneurship are anchored in a certain soil, which could be described by what the values that make up this soil and the kind of ingredients, the kind of nourishment this would bring to the entrepreneur and the leader. I'm aware of, I've been to Bioneer several times. I know Rob has as well. So we hold the long-standing integration of indigeneity in Bioneers as a space of innovation. And so this next question is about how entrepreneurship connects to innovation. And just to contrast, to bring in a negative contrast as a place to bounce off of, Facebook has 2 billion plus members, or I don't know what does one call people who are on Facebook?
Yes.
But I hesitate to say members because we don't control our information, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
But here we have, you began speaking this time by speaking about how heroes and what we recognize as heroism. And so here's a business that is very much in the control of one or two people. And when it came about, one would say, well, there was significant technological and social innovation. And something's been missing the entire time in its development.
Yes.
And I just kept hearing that in your response to the last question. So this is, I guess, more of a comment, but an invitation for you to, you and what you and Kenny did with Pioneers very much holds a different understanding of innovation in how you have been a generative entrepreneur. And what is this understanding of innovation, and how does it connect to the values agenda that you just spoke to?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to contemplate for a minute. I mean, you know, what I'm aware of as I listen to you is the first book that I wrote and edited is actually called Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart. But it does have examples in it that are men as well, which I'm very happy about. Because I do feel like part of what I have learned over time, both from Indigenous teachers and models, but also from studying leadership, is that the leadership that is most regenerative for the leaders, as well as being most effective, is leadership that in many ways is sourced principally from a deep, deep valuing, a love, if you will, a passion to protect or defend or reinvent something for the benefit of the whole. And so I think I've learned from Indigenous peoples that leadership has to come more from the heart than from the head. And in your example about Facebook, obviously, you know, there was this potentially good idea about how to help people connect, but without any real values alignment in terms of what were they connecting for and what is the depth of connection that becomes possible within the context of that technology. And what is the responsibility of the connector? I mean, this is a place where, in a sense, I might suggest that the realm of relationship, which has become much more important in our consideration as innovators than the accumulation of things, has been relegated to the realm of the quote feminine, and therefore devalued and seen perceived in a rather shallow context. Whereas what you're describing, and certainly the kind of relational connections that I'm most interested in creating, are deeply imbued with values, and they are perpetuated because of a really, there is little question that love is the most powerful thing on earth. And it is renewable, it is regenerative. And as innovators, I think that, that's why as I coach people in leadership, I'm always coaching them to go for what they have the deepest care and passion about, because that is what is undying. That's the ember that doesn't burn out. And I think what I would say about innovation with respect to pioneers is that part of my learning over time has been how important it is to listen. That I think part of our inherited model of leadership is imagining we know the answers and coming on strong with a position or a perspective. And Pioneers really is in service to so many communities and cultures that we have to listen very attentively year by year. And I do believe that our capacity to keep it alive for 30 years has been predicated largely on that. And so, for me, innovation at this point, some of the innovation that I'm most excited about involves innovation that is biomimicry, that's learning from nature how to imitate nature's systems, or in some sense, the adoption and the adaptation of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous wisdom. Because I believe that most of what we need lies embedded in those two sources, if you will, and that therefore, innovation is not just about having a good idea, it's about testing the idea and being continually innovating so that it is, because we're living in such a rapidly changing world, that good idea may need to be evolved on a very regular and flexible basis. And so I think the most exciting innovation to me is that which is really interactive with the community or communities that it's meant to serve.
The term innovation still evokes a male or masculine set of connotations. And it's worth pointing out, not everyone might realize this, that the co-founding, that a woman and a man co-founded Pioneers, and Pioneers being a take on, which is coining a new term from pioneers, so that innovation is at the heart of the idea, and it is brought forward and sustained and stewarded over 30 years by a relationship. So all of this seems quite meaningful in terms of what was in the seed of Pioneers 30 years ago and how it was able to become a space for innovations that were values-based, because it itself was that. And then comes relational intelligence, relational development. You use the term relational mindfulness. So the relational as itself, or as a doorway into cultural innovation. And that you have been able to bring together the social and the cultural in how you've been an innovator. And perhaps technology as well. I'm less clear about how technology, but you did mention biomimicry. And I know I have attended sessions at Bioneers that clearly show the technological part of what you've been up to. So could you speak about how the social, cultural, and technological dimensions of innovation have come together for you in terms of your work as a social and generative entrepreneur?
Well, first of all, I really want to appreciate your naming the core of relationship that Bioneers has grown out of. And also to say that, frankly, as a woman, I don't believe that I began Bioneers as a wholly equal partner, or I certainly didn't see myself that way. And it took a lot of persevering time and effort to grow myself into being a fully co-equal partner. I think other people saw me that way well before I saw myself that way. So it's one of the things that I've come to understand as I've worked with women in leadership is that we have inherited so many self-limiting ideas about what our capacities are, that it's really important for us to be continually sort of self-reflecting and shedding that which we have inherited from culture, and I'm certain this is true for men as well, which are no longer serving us because there's so much, both about gender identities and about leadership and all of that. I think what's been true for me is that from very early on, Bioneers has known that it's not only Kenny and I that program it, we work in a very much of a team-based model. And we have known that we have many different constituencies to serve. So, we literally program for 13 different domains. And what's been exciting over the last couple of years has really been learning how to use social media and online communications much better to help spread the ideas and the visions and the talks and the media from Bioneers to much wider audiences. But I think what's been exciting to me has been recognizing that one of my favorite quotes that I refer to inwardly all the time comes from Fritjof Capra, who you may know, who's an Austrian physicist and ecologist. And he says, the key to an eco-literate society involves a shift from prioritizing counting things to mapping relationship. And we have precious little practice or training in how to map and then cultivate and deepen relationship. And in many ways, what I am seeing as one of the greatest challenges of this time is creating connective tissue among fields that have seen themselves as disparate or have been falsely separated, but are in fact completely connected. So when we first started Bioneers, we thought, well, surely the people working on river restoration and oceans will know each other and they'll be connected. And only to discover, no, in fact, they're in completely segregated fields, and that part of the power of convening in a way that creates connection is to help those leaders to connect among each other. And because they say that the surest way to strengthen an ecosystem is to connect it to more of itself. And I feel like what Bioneers has taught me over time is that we cannot address ecological repair without addressing social equity at the same time. We simply can't reinvent education without also addressing economics and governance. That really, and green design and industrial design, all of these things, that in fact they're all manifestations of a worldview in a sense. And because we are in a time that involves a paradigm shift from a worldview that has atomized and segregated things to a worldview that can work for the good of the whole, it's a practice, I think, for innovators and leaders of a certain quality of perpetual self-reflection and perpetual discernment to say, is this something I'm doing by habit? Or is this a habit that I need to question because it may be creating more harm than good? It may not be the best approach for the outcome that I most want to achieve. So I think part of the paradigm shift, if you will, that we're in involves a shift from a focus on goals and outcomes and products to recognizing that the process and how we get there and the relationships that are involved have at least equal value to our final outcomes, and that they contribute in an inextricable way to what we finally produce. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but I did the best I could.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It opened several more questions, which signals a good response. But I will restrain myself and open our space for what is being evoked for others. I can see how people are affected, or that they are affected by what you're saying. And I'm especially aware, Aisling, that your work and aspirations are very attuned with what Nina's been saying. So perhaps you'll make our next move and then we'll continue to widen from there.
Just to say, I'm drinking in your words, Nina, like nectar. It's fantastic. And I suppose on many levels it kind of resonates with where I'm at. I feel very much emergent in what you've already formed and manifested and created. But the resonance is so much there. And even your languaging around connective tissue, to put things in this nature-based terminology is a deep passion of mine. How can we look to living systems to give us the intelligences that we need now as humanity, to sort of view things as the connective tissue instead of the atomized individuals? Yes. I just lap up that kind of language. So thank you so much. My own work is with women in transformative leadership. Starting a course in the west of Ireland Sunday week with a group of between 6 and 8 women. So it's very much how do we weave the feminine with our masculine acting in the world. And I suppose archetypally, I think of that as the hieros gamos, the sacred knowledge. I loved hearing as well that you founded an organization with your partner. If it wasn't too personal, I'd wonder, how does that actually go? I'm thinking of founding something with my partner. Many resonances. I suppose I'm wondering, with your work, does it speak to the converted, or do you find that you're able to find inroads to people to whom these ideas, these practices, these languagings are new? Is it peripheral, or are you now working with, say, more mainstream bodies, is a question I have.
Well, it's a great question. They're both great questions, actually. Is it Aisling? Am I pronouncing that right? Oh, good. Well, I'm excited to hear what you're doing. And the short answer to your question around that you were delicate in posing around how is it working with my partner. Right now, it's great. And we have been through terribly difficult, arduous times to get here. Many of which I guess I would have to say had to do with my own and our own working out of archetypal power issues. I think for me anyway, I definitely seem to have a human design that involves translating from the personal to the more universal. And so, and my husband and partner is a very outspoken kind of young fellow who I had to butt up against in a lot of, difficult ways in order to birth my own sense of full ownership and equality. But so I often feel like when people kind of idolize us and say, oh, you're so lucky you get to work with your partner. And I want to say, be careful, it's not for the faint of heart. And hopefully you have good astrology with each other and good chemistry, and it will carry you through the hard times, because that's what we've needed. And in terms of your other question, what I find, Aisling, is that I think the idea, at least in this country, I'm not sure about yours because I obviously don't know, but in this country, the idea of a mainstream is sort of a fallacy, because really we live in a culture of subcultures. And what I find with pioneers is that people tend to come in through one area of interest. And it might be women's leadership, or it might be youth leadership, or it might be education or green building. And then suddenly they find themselves, I think of it as coming in through one fractal of a mirror ball. And then they find themselves in the middle of the mirror ball going, oh, look how it's all connected. So that's part of our purpose in Pioneers. What I find for myself on a more personal level is that I'm 63 now, and so I've been going through several years of deep introspection about my next chapter and how I'm serving and whether it's the most effective thing I could do with my particular gifts. And, it's just another one of those life transition times that we all have. And there's some voice inside me that I think is an inherited one that I need to shed, that says, oh, you have too many areas of focus, because I'm really interested in the reinvention of entrepreneurship. And I'm also really interested in gender and in leadership and in spirituality and in indigeneity and in how they all intersect with natural systems and within a context that's big enough to contain them all. And what I find is that increasingly I get invited to something like this, which is about one facet, and yet there are people there who relate on all these different levels. And that as someone who has had a fascination with the reinvention of leadership for 20 years, what I love is that leadership is big enough to encompass everybody, that actually we are living in a time when we're all called to be leaders, and that, parenting is one of the most challenging and growthful forms of leadership I can imagine. And so I find that a very inclusive frame, and I find it one that can actually permeate, I don't know about the mainstream, but into many different subcultures, and therefore affect change in people's awareness. Best I can offer.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for what you're up to. The other thing, I see that Maria wrote relational mindfulness on the chat board. And I should mention that my use of that phrase really comes from a woman who I collaborate with as a teacher in workshops. And she is a woman who spent 7 years in a Zen monastery as a monk. And when she left the monastery, she realized that what she had been taught of mindfulness was too masculine a model and didn't feel balanced enough. And so she has reframed the practice of mindfulness as relational mindfulness. And she has a book out, and her name is Deborah Eden Tull. And it's beautiful, beautiful work, because it really helps create a context in which we are mindfully attending to all the facets of ourselves within ourselves. And that's a practice that helps us attend to all the facets and people around us in whatever aspect of innovation and entrepreneurship we may be emergent in. So I love that. And I just wanted to credit Eden because it's beautiful, beautiful work. I'd love to hear from others.
It promises to bring this interest in mindfulness into another more deeply culturally transformative possibilities.
Yes.
Is by connecting the relational with the interest in mindfulness.
Exactly. And we work together to teach leading through relational mindfulness and also relational mindfulness and the deep feminine. And for each of us, we are really profoundly interested in, if you will, mainstreaming the connection between inner work and outer effectiveness and outer activism even, and leadership in the world, that they are integrally connected, and that in fact it's part of the sorrow of this time is that there's such a spread of inner awareness without connecting it to engaged action.
About almost 40 years ago, when I was first getting into meditation, I asked an English Buddhist teacher who I was on retreat with how he understood what happened to Buddhism over these 2,000 years, because I mentioned to him that being in Thailand, I was not impressed with seeing a society which actually did have Buddhism at it as part of its mainstream, that I wasn't impressed with what I saw in that, and my experience of the Buddhist monks with their begging bowls around the city. And his response was, keep meditating, which I have done. However, I do see how important that question was at that time.
Yes. In
seeing how Buddhism unfolded and what this next great turn of our understanding of mindfulness practice could do. So I find your move to connect the relational with mindfulness, somehow I imagine it as that's what I was trying to understand. Back then, in bringing up what I was seeing, what my experience of the Buddhist monks who were all men. Something in there. Okay.
Aftab, though, can I just say one thing? Because again, your comment really raises something for me, which is that one could readily ask what has happened to all the world's organized religions, and that each of them in their own way have been corrupted. That look at the misuse of Catholicism, for heaven's sake, and the incredible harms that have been done in its name. And I'm finding, as someone with a strong urge toward racial justice and social justice, that I'm retracing my Jewish heritage to find where are the roots in Judaism that I can actually wholeheartedly claim as part of my heritage, because there's lots about Judaism that I don't claim and I don't feel connected to. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Dave.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for everything you're sharing, Nina. I find it incredibly exciting. In fact, there's just too much I'd love to respond to, and there isn't time, and I want to give other people the opportunity to share. But I thought the idea that you were bringing, that generative leadership means sourcing from liminal space and deeply held passion. My own startup leadership development business is called Generative, partly founded on this insight that, you know, to be really connected as leaders, we need to encompass self, other, and system in our consciousness. But I think so primarily because that's not happening, there's a lack of imagination about the possibility of the future. And I because of group practice and we-based practice and relational mindfulness that I've done, I've got deep confidence in that possibility. But it's not been seen through my own lens. It's been seen through the lens of a collective. So my own sense of self has expanded through being in that collective. Therefore, my sense of possibility of the beauty and harmony that human beings can share together, I couldn't do that on my own. I needed a collective through which to experience that emerging future. So I'm wondering, I'm sure this is something that ground that you've trod upon. I was interested in your experience and what you'd like to share about that.
Oh my. Well, I love what you're doing and thank you. That's super exciting. You know, certainly I feel like my own course of inquiry right now is about how to be a better bridge builder. And I'm recognizing that really we are alive in a time when bridge building is of the essence. And when part of our cultural inheritance has been to avoid difficulty and darkness and challenge. And it's an interesting thing that comes up in relation to the generative word is that I gave a talk at Pioneers last year that you can see on the website because my mother had died recently. And I spoke about how we've all inherited a bias towards birth and progress and newness, while also inheriting this deep cultural aversion towards death and endings and challenge and conflict. And so, you know, one of my favorite mentors, a woman named Donna Markova, says that relationship is a function of rupture and repair, and that it's all a question of how we turn towards or away from each other when ruptures happen. That really, whether you're considering relationship with a child, a parent, a coworker, a colleague, or a team, ruptures will happen. And that if we can reorient ourselves around the value of the ruptures so that we can all collectively midwife a culture that actually can hold opposing views simultaneously and really be polyvisionary, if you will. That's the collaborative culture that really wants to be born right now. And so I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like I am in a continual practice of learning to step in other people's shoes and to allow myself to really open on all levels to the full inspiration of the sheroes and heroes that I see out there, who are modeling the kind of leadership that I still aspire to, and also to challenge myself to take risks, to keep taking risks, and to, you know, one of my favorite, another little gem that I would offer you is that a woman named Jeanette Armstrong, who is an elder from the Okanagan Nation in British Columbia, says that in her view, her people operate around a practice that they call the Four Societies. And it's worth looking up online because there are some great essays about it. She says, in her view, the greatest perspective that anyone can offer her is one that's 180 degrees opposed from her own, because it requires her to expand her perspective enough to be able to encompass that as well. And I think, you know, we are transitioning from an either-or culture in which, you know, the habitual pattern is to get dug in about being right, to one that is spacious enough And spaciousness thrives in the feminine, and feminine thrives in spaciousness, to be able to encompass a variety of views and really integrate them into a different picture of what's best for the whole. It was beautiful, Dave. Thank you.
Thank
I want to
you.
hear all your other questions too, though.
Catherine, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. No, please.
Catherine is from the Philippines and works out of the Philippines Embassy in Berlin.
Wow.
Catherine, where has your imagination been going while we've been talking?
Well, thank you so much for that amazing sharing, Nina. With what you shared, as well as over the past weeks, it's like I feel like it has really expanded my universe, actually. You can imagine that in the work that I do as a diplomat, as a bureaucrat, the way that things are interpreted, like the idea of innovation, for example, is quite narrow. It's like innovation in terms of technology, innovation as a way of making profit. So it's quite amazing to be listening to these terms given a new meaning and a more expansive, more encompassing meaning. And I hope that, you know, with this new language and stories, I can continue, because I was telling the group earlier that I'm looking at transitioning into doing something else, because I feel that what I'm doing here at the embassy, where I am the economic officer, is I'm finding it increasingly hard to do this work and at the same time to be true to the things that I believe in and that I value. Yeah. So actually just one of the things that I really value, at least in what I do, is I'm also the gender focal point of the embassy. And in that sense, I hope that I can make use of this idea of, you know, the feminizing, the way that we do, for example, economic diplomacy. How can we reconcile these things? So thank you so much for your insights.
Wow. Well, Catherine, what's vividly apparent to me right now is that two things from your remarks. One is that our whole understanding of economics is due for a massive reinvention. That in fact, it's been economics as a field has been more based on ideology than on anything holistic or systemic. And that in fact, because economics has been so bereft of social consciousness and of a kind of psychological understanding of human beings, it has in many ways really been a failed system. But the other thing that I'm aware of in hearing you and imagining where you are is that, you know, globally we are in such a time of the rise of nationalism and of white supremacy and of othering, that social innovation is perhaps more needed than almost anything else. And opening the pathways for people who are deeply identified with a belief system to begin to sort of crack their ideology and open the possibility for a new worldview is incredibly needed and incredibly exciting. So I would just encourage you to follow your heart and trust that if you're doing what you're most passionate about, the opportunities will come your way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Maria, Joaquin, and
Yeah, I just wanted to say also, I really appreciate the depth of this conversation about the feminine and the masculine. And there is so much that can be heard about this. There's a lot of simplistic thinking about this, I think, and a lot of cliches, and this is what it means, and that is what it means. Everybody has an opinion about it. And I think this conversation here was not like that. I mean, it was, I think, I mean, I'm not going to be able to bring this to the point now. I'm definitely going to have my wife watch this recording of this, and we're going to watch it together. So, you know, some kind of a extension of this connection. And one thing, if I just may add, you had on this more symbolic level, you were talking about line and circle at one point, right? So
Yes.
My understanding would be the line is this linear thinking, and that would be more the masculine versus the circular feminine. Of course, what comes to mind is the spiral as combination.
Yes.
And the spiral is, you know, that means essentially that you pick up on a higher level again at that same point. And I think this is kind of the, from what I feel is a determining kind of, you know, maybe a symbol, a guiding symbol.
Yes.
And yeah, so thank you very much.
Oh, gosh, my pleasure. And thank you for naming those things. You know, ordinarily, I would not have even mentioned the masculine and feminine without first saying that, of course, we all have masculine and feminine within us. And I believe that regardless of our temporary gender assignment, if you will, or whatever body we happen to be born in, we all have repair and reinvention to do around those gendered identities within ourselves, and that as you named, the hieros gamos is the most evolved form of human development that I can identify, you know, and also thank you for naming the spiral, because, you know, the spiral is the most ubiquitous form in nature, and it's one of the ways that nature resolves conflict. That seaweed, when it gets hit by waves, spirals in order to adapt to the waves' pressure. And when you pour cold milk into hot coffee, it forms a spiral. So it's one of nature's ways of reconciling conflict, which I always love. So yes, all three. And there is, you know, I don't even mean to say that we need to throw out the linear. There are places as leaders and innovators for the linear, but we've grown to rely on it far too heavily, I think. Yeah. And where's Maria?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for the inspiration, and there's so much richness. I think I will be listening to this recording for quite a few times, still digesting and further processing.
Thank you.
What I'm sitting with is something around the contribution of the arts. And the arts as both individual and collective expression of intelligence. And yes, and how they can be our means of communication and relating at a level that is very much needed right now, meaning in a more profound and more polyphonic way, of poly-connecting way. So, and it's more a reflection than a question, I guess, but I'd love to hear how you approach that.
Well, thank you for that question. I actually came to my career from the arts first, because I believed that live theater was the best way to transform people's consciousness. I believed that an embodied experience that challenged people's worldviews was the most exciting thing I could imagine to do. And so I love your question, because I am in a perpetual inquiry about how arts are essential for the accessing visions of the new world that we're all bringing into form, and that people can receive things through the arts in a way that no argument will ever do, and no course will ever achieve, and no written paper is ever going to do. So I am also in a space of wondering how we not only bring back to center the arts in our innovation and entrepreneurship and movement building, but also, I feel as though the arts were co-opted somewhere along the way by this very hierarchical structure that said the arts are the domain of the elite. And really, if you look back at all of the social movement building and revolutions that have happened through human history, the arts have been absolutely essential. And I often wonder, Maria, where the songs are for this revolution. We are constantly scanning for poets and artists and performance artists with pioneers who can help bring this work into people's hearts, because I think there can be a direct transmission into the heart that comes through arts and not any other way. So, and I love what you said about polymorphic and polyrhythmic, and, really, aren't we moving from a vision of the world that was based on this pyramidal structure to one that is polyphonic, as you said, and polyperspectual. I don't even know if that's a word, but it's pluralistic at the very least, and therefore widely inclusive. And so I'm with you. And yes, let's encourage the artists every which way we can. I currently have a very personal project that's not very public, but I'm working with small, diverse groups of women who are leading social change, who are also artists and creatives, to cross-pollinate them with women who are donor activists, who believe in transforming culture as a way to change the world, so that we can help fund some of their work, because typically they're all operating on a shoestring, and boy, is that not sustainable. So Thank you for asking, and thank you for whatever you're doing in relation to it.
Well, I've recently been invited in a beautiful initiative called Feminine Eldership Rising.
Ooh.
And my driving question around that is, what's the life of a muse?
Of a muse?
A muse.
Yes.
Muse as the archetype.
Yes.
of the artists.
Gosh, will you send me a link? I want to know about that.
Yes, I can actually post it here.
Thank you.
Maria is Greek and lives on the island of Rhodes.
And I see you are pulling together Next Stage World.
Yes, yes. And both Maria and I are part of this team that's been meeting in Greece for a few years. And last year we had Nora Bateson join us in this work of, in this work of culture.
Yes.
Adding to the social. Nina, you mentioned a talk that's on your website.
Yeah.
And I noticed that there are several talks there. I would like to put a link into, there are about 25 of us in this course.
Okay.
And I'd like to put on the learning platform, I'd like to put a link to that.
Okay.
So this is the talk, which can you just say a bit more so I get the right link?
It's the talk that I gave last year in 2019, and I can't remember what it was called.
Okay. Well, the 2019 will work.
Okay, good.
I'll be able to, yeah.
Perfect.
And who was the talk to? What was the setting?
The setting was, it was the very opening of the Bioneers Conference.
Okay.
And it was a 15-minute talk. And I'm only sorry that I didn't put a slide up of my mother, but my mother had died like 2 months before, less than that. And so I really couldn't see how to open a talk about anything that didn't include the death of my mother, since it was so huge in my psyche at the time. And I recognized that we're all living through a time of so much death and so much being born that it might be useful to context it in that way. So, yeah, that's what I did. And thank you. What a wonderful group you have. I want to know about what everyone's doing. It's so exciting.
So Nina, thank you for being such an inspiring cultural entrepreneur and cultural leader. I would just like to honor what you have shared with a line from a male poet who did a lot with his own feminine, D.H. Lawrence. And the lines go like this. There is a fine wind blowing the next direction of time. There's a fine wind blowing the next direction of time. If only I could let it bear me, carry me.
Wow.
So,
that's exquisitely beautiful. Thank you.
So very glad to be around what you are being carried by. And thank you to you, and thank you to everybody else for engaging so heartfully and saying goodbye for now.
And I'm so grateful for this opportunity. And I just want to say I'm grateful if my words have been useful. I do feel tremendously humble always about how much I'm learning continually in my life, and how many amazing people I stand on the shoulders of. So deep, deep thanks to you and to you all.
Thanks for joining us. Integral Voices is produced by the Center for Transformative Learning at Meridian University. All episodes are available at meridianuniversity.edu/Integral Voices. For more information about Meridian, including upcoming public courses, other podcasts, and information sessions, visit meridianuniversity.edu. See you next time.